At 47, Cora Mabry owned nothing in the world but the clothes stiffening on her back and $11 folded into the hem of her sleeve. The bank had taken the rest her husband Daniel scarcely cold in the Alder Valley clay when Hollis Thorne, who held every note and mortgage from Sable Gulch to the high timber, foreclosed on the farm they had broken with their own 2 pairs of hands, and told her, not unkindly, that a valley in ruin had no more use for a widow who could not pay. So she did a foolish thing. On a raw April morning in the crash year of 1893, with the silver markets collapsing and grown men weeping in the mud of the main street, she climbed to the burned-out chapel on Vane's Hill and paid $2, 2 whole dollars she could not spare for the cracked chapel bell that had hung silent above the town for 30 years. They laughed at her in the road, but something had been sealed inside that bronze a long time ago, something that would lift a ruined woman out of the dust and a whole valley with her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cora Mabry. And if you are watching tonight from a place that everyone else has given up on, a town that emptied out, a house nobody wanted, a life the world decided to write off, tell us in the comments where you are, so we might carry your name a little way up that hill alongside hers. To understand why a starving woman would spend her last coins on a broken bell, you have to understand the hands she was born into. Cora came into the world in a wagon that smelled of coal smoke and hot metal, the daughter of an itinerant bell founder named Elias Reeve, a lean and patient man who could pour molten bronze into a clay mold and coax from it, a voice that made strangers stop in the road and take off their hats. Her mother had died when Cora was small, and so the child grew up in the roar and hush of her father's trade, learning things most girls never touched. She learned that bronze is a marriage copper and tin, 4 parts to 1, and that the marriage must be perfect or the voice comes out cracked and sour. She learned that you tune a bell not by adding metal, but by shaving it away from the inside. Patient turn after patient turn, until the tone comes true. She learned that every honest founder cut his private mark into the crown before the metal cooled, the way a painter signs a corner, so that a bell might travel 100 years and still speak the name of the one who made it. And she learned, kneeling beside her father in a dozen frontier towns, that a bell is the one possession a poor community shares equally. It rings the same for the banker and the beggar, for the wedding and the burying, and it belongs, truly, to no one and to everyone at once. Her father taught her something else, too, something that was not about metal at all. In a hard camp in the Nevada hills, when a mine owner tried to cheat Elias of his fee after the bell was hung and singing, the old man did not curse or fight. He simply stood in the town square and rang that bell with his own hands, slow and clear, until every soul had gathered, and then he told them, plainly and without heat, exactly what had been done to him. The owner paid before the sun went down, not from shame, for he had none, but because a whole town had heard the truth spoken in the open, and truth spoken in the open has a weight that money cannot lift. Cora, her father said afterward, wiping his hands, a lie only lives in the dark. Ring it into the light, and it cannot survive the sound. She was 9 years old, and she never forgot it. When Elias died, Cora was already a grown woman with metal-scarred hands and an ear that could hear a flaw in a casting before it ever rang. She might have carried on his trade, but the country was changing, and the great foundries in the East were pouring bells by the hundred, and there was no living left in it for a lone woman with a wagon. So she came to the Alder Valley in Colorado, to the silver town of Sable Gulch, cupped in its green bowl of mountains, and there she met Daniel Mabry, a quiet homesteader with kind eyes and a stubborn quarter section of rocky ground, and she married him and put down roots for the first time in her life. They were not rich, but Cora made their little farm sing the way her father made metal sing. She mended what others threw away. She read the weather in the aspen leaves. She could take a ruined thing and see, underneath the ruin, the sound it was meant to make. The valley folk came to know her as the woman who could fix what could not be fixed, and she was content, and she thought the wandering part of her life was over. She was wrong about that, but not in the way she feared. The fall, when it came the way the mountain snow comes down slow flakes first, and then the whole slope at once, burying everything. It began with the silver. For years, the whole Alder Valley had lived and breathed on the price of silver. the ore that came out of the Sable Gulch mines and put bread on every table. And no man had grown fatter on it than Hollis Thorne, who owned the bank, the mercantile, the freight line, and, one small paper at a time, nearly every mortgage in the valley. Thorne was not a loud villain. He was worse. He was a smiling one, a broad, soft man in a clean collar who called everyone friend and remembered every child's name, and who had learned that in a boom no one reads the fine print on a loan. And then, in the spring of that terrible year, the government stopped buying silver, and the price fell through the floor overnight, and the mines went dark, and the whole valley that had been built on a single shining metal woke up one morning to find that metal was worth nothing at all. Daniel took a fever that same spring, the wet kind that settles in the chest, and Cora nursed him through 6 weeks of it with mustard poultices and every herb she knew. And still, she lost him on a gray morning with the last snow melting off the fence rails. She buried him herself, for there was no money to pay for more. And she stood alone at his grave with the mountains blank and beautiful all around her, and thought that the worst had surely already happened. But Hollis Thorne was only just then unrolling his paper. With the mines dead and no man in the valley able to make a payment, Thorne began to foreclose, gently, regretfully, friend by friend, and what he took, he kept. Farm after farm fell into his hands for pennies on the dollar, and Cora came to understand, too late, that the crash had not ruined Thorne at all. It had made him. He had seen it coming the way she could see a flaw in a casting, and he had positioned himself to catch the whole valley as it fell, so that when the dust settled he would own every stick and stone of it, and the people who had built it would work it as his tenants or leave. Cora's turn came in April. Thorne rode out to the farm himself, in a buggy with a lap robe, though the day was mild, and he sat there and told her that Daniel's note was 3 payments behind, and that the bank could carry it no longer. She offered him the $11 in her sleeve. She offered to work the land on shares. She offered him the milk cow and the good plow and the seed corn she had saved. He shook his head at all of it, still smiling, and said the sad word insolvent the way another man might say a prayer, and told her she had until Friday to be gone. "It's only business, Mrs. Mabry," he said, gathering his reins. "You understand. The valley has to be practical now. A woman alone, no money, no man. There's simply no place for you here anymore." And he tipped his hat and drove away. And Cora stood in the yard of the farm she and Daniel had wrung out of the rock, and she understood that she had become, in a single sentence, a woman the world had decided to throw away. She did not weep. That was not in her. Instead, on the Friday, she walked away from the farm with a bundle on her back and $11 in her sleeve and no notion at all of where she would sleep that night, and her feet, from some old habit she did not question, carried her up the switchback trail to Vane's Hill, to the ruined chapel that crowned the town. She had gone there sometimes with Daniel, on still evenings, to look down on the lamps coming out in the valley. The chapel had burned in a lightning fire 30 years before and never been rebuilt. Only the stone shell of it remained, roofless and open to the sky, and in the weed-choked yard, half sunk in the earth, on a rotted timber cradle, lay the old bell. It had cracked in the fire, a long jagged split running up from the lip, and been hauled down from the tower and left to the rain, too broken to ring and too heavy to be worth the hauling. Cora had passed it 100 times, but on this evening, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go, she stopped, and she looked at the ruined bell the way she looked at everything ruined, and something in her went very still. It was the color that caught her first. Bronze that has weathered 30 seasons in the open should be dark, near black, furred with green corrosion. This bell, where the rain had worn it clean, showed a strange pale gleam under the grime, almost silver in the last light, and Cora's founder's eye said at once that no ordinary bell metal wears that way. She knelt in the wet grass and laid her scarred hands on the cold curve of it, and she felt, running under her palms, the faint raised lines of a founder's mark, and beneath the mark, where no mark should ever be, a band of fine relief lettering circling the whole crown, fair and hidden with the grime of decades. Her heart began to beat very hard. She took the $11 from her sleeve and counted them in her palm, and then she went back down the hill in the dark to the little Methodist mission that had inherited the chapel's ground, and she found the old caretaker, Amos Pell, and she asked him what he would take for the broken bell up on the hill. Amos Pell looked at her as though she had asked to buy the moon. The bell was scrap, he told her, cracked past mending, and the mission had tried for years to sell it for the metal, and no founder would touch it because the alloy rang false, too soft, they said. Spoiled somehow, worthless, even melted down. He'd give it away to be rid of the eyesore, but the mission's own rule said church property must be sold, not given, so as to keep an honest account. Then I'll buy it, Cora said, fair and square, with a receipt, so it's mine clear, and no man can say otherwise. She could not have told him why the words came out so careful, why she needed it clean and legal and witnessed. She only knew, with her father's instinct, that this mattered. Amos scratched his head and named a price meant as a kindness to himself. $2 then, and you haul it yourself. And Cora Mabry, 47 years old and worth $11 in all the world, laid 2 of them into his hand and took the little penciled receipt and folded it away as if it were a deed to a kingdom. The men at the mercantile heard of it by morning, and they laughed until they had to hold the counter the mad Mabry widow, penniless, buying a busted bell nobody could ring. Let them laugh, Cora thought. She had heard something in that bronze that they could not hear. She just did not yet know what it was. She had no wagon and no team, so she could not haul the bell anywhere, and in truth she had nowhere to haul it to. So she made her camp in the roofless chapel itself, beside her purchase, sleeping in a nest of her blankets against the old stone, and by day she went to work on the bell the way her father had taught her, slowly, reverently, with a rag and a pan of water hauled up from the spring. She spent 3 days doing nothing but cleaning it, wiping 30 years of grime and lichen from the metal inch by patient inch, and as the grime came away, the band of hidden lettering rose up out of the bronze into the light, and Cora read it, and her breath stopped in her throat. It was not a Bible verse, as bell inscriptions almost always are. It was a list of names, 24 of them, cast right into the crown in fine raised letters: Reyes, and Kowalczyk, and 2 bears, and Okafor, and Halloran, and Vane, and a dozen more, the names of every founding family of the Alder Valley, the poor and the plain and the foreign, the ones who had come with nothing and dug the first ditches and raised the first roofs. And beneath the ring of names, circling the very sound bow of the bell where the clapper would strike, ran a single line: This bell is the trust of all who are named here, and the ransom of the valley in its hour of ruin. Let no man own it. Let it be spent only to raise the fallen. Cora sat back on her heels in the roofless chapel with the mountains going gold around her, and she read that line over and over, and slowly, the way a bell's tone gathers and blooms after the strike, she began to understand. She knew bell metal. She knew that the alloy of an honest bell is copper and tin and nothing else, and that any other metal poured into the mix would spoil the voice and crack the casting under stress, which was exactly what the founders had told Amos Pell about this bell, that it rang false, that the alloy was soft and worthless. But what if it rang false because it was not only bronze? What if someone, long ago, had melted something else into it on purpose, something soft, something that muffled the true tone, something a poor valley might pour into a single sacred object precisely because no thief would ever think to steal a church bell, and no bank could ever foreclose on the voice of God? The pale silver gleam, the wrong weight, for now that she thought of it, this bell was far too heavy for its size. The spoiled, muffled ring, the band of names, the word ransom. Cora's hands began to shake, and she pressed them flat against the cold metal to still them. And she whispered to her dead father and her dead husband and the empty gold sky, "There's silver cast inside you. There's a whole valley's savings poured into your bones." She could not yet prove it, and she was too careful a woman to melt down a thing on a guess. So she went looking for the story, because a bell like this does not come from nowhere, and a founder does not cut 24 names into a crown without a record somewhere of what she meant by it. The mark she had found beneath the names told her where to look. It was a founder's mark she half knew, a small poured device shaped like an alder leaf, and the family name Vane on the crown, and the hill itself called Vane's Hill. All pointed one direction. She went down into the town and she asked the oldest people she could find, the ones too old to work and too poor to have been worth foreclosing on. And from them, piece by piece over a week of patient listening, she gathered the story of Alma Vane. Alma Vane had been the founder of the valley in every sense, not just its first settler, but a literal bell founder. A widow herself who had come west in the 50s with her late husband's trade in her own two hands, the only woman anyone had ever heard of in the craft. And she had built the first foundry and the first chapel, and had held the ragged first families together through blizzard and drought and the greed of the land agents who circled every new settlement like wolves. And Cora, hearing it, felt the years fold over on themselves. Two widows with metal-scarred hands and the same stubborn refusal to let the vultures win, 40 years apart on the same hill. The old people remembered more once Cora sat with them and let them talk. They remembered that in the hard winter of '61 there had come a land agent named Croft, a smiling, soft man, and here Cora went cold, for she had met his like who had claimed by some legal trick that the valley's titles were void and that every family must buy their own land back from him or be driven off. The families had no money to fight him in a far-off court and no money to buy back what was already theirs, and it seemed the valley was lost before it had rightly begun. And Alma Vane had gathered them all in her chapel, every family, and told them there was one thing the agent's paper could not touch and no court could seize, one thing that belonged to all of them equally and to none of them alone. And that spring, in secret, every family in the valley had brought to Alma's foundry what silver. They had coins, spoons, a wedding ring, a dead child's christening cup, the melted pennies of the poorest, and Alma Vane had poured it, all of it, together with the copper and tin, into the great new bell she cast for the chapel, and cut their names into the crown, and set it ringing over the valley, where no thief and no agent could ever reach it. The bell was the bank the valley kept in the open air, and it worked for the agent Croft, unable to break their unity, at last moved on to easier prey, and the crisis passed, and the valley grew, and the silver mines came in a few years later and made everyone comfortable, and the bell's true nature slid slowly out of living memory, remembered only as a legend the old folks half believed, until the lightning took the chapel in '63, and Alma Vane died the following winter, and the cracked bell was hauled down and forgotten. Worthless, everyone said, because it rang so false. It rang false, Cora Mabry thought, because it was never truly a bell at all. It was a promise. It was 24 poor families pouring everything they had into one indestructible shape and trusting the future to keep faith with the past. And here was the future. Here was the valley in its second hour of ruin, foreclosed and emptied by another smiling man. And here was Alma Vane's ransom lying in the weeds, sold for $2 to the one person left in the whole valley who could read what was written on it. Cora went back up the hill and sat by the bell all night, not sleeping, and she thought about what $11 worth of silver, cast 40 years ago, might be worth now, poured out and honestly weighed, and she thought about how easily a woman the world had thrown away, could take a chisel and a fire and a dark night and cut loose a fortune and disappear over the mountains, a rich woman, and let the valley that had laughed at her rot. No one would ever know. The receipt in her pocket said the bell was hers, bought clean and legal. It would be by any law of men, entirely and only hers. But the inscription said, "Let no man own it. Let it be spent only to raise the fallen." And Cora Mabry was Elias Reeves' daughter, and she had learned at 9 years old that a lie only lives in the dark. So she made her choice up there in the roofless chapel, alone, with no one watching and nothing to gain by it. And having made it, she came down the mountain not as a thief in the night, but in the plain light of a Tuesday morning, and she began, quietly, to gather the fallen. She did not announce herself. She was too wise for that, for she knew that the moment Hollis Thorne understood what lay in the bell, he would find a way to take it a lawyer's trick, a lien, a claim that church property could not be sold, anything. So Cora moved the way her father moved when he was cheated, patiently, in the open, gathering witnesses. She went first to the old families, whose names were on the crown, the Halloran boys and the Two Bears sisters and the Okafor widow, the ones who had been foreclosed and were living now in the shacks along the creek, and she brought them one at a time up the hill and showed them the ring of names, and let them read for themselves the name of their own grandfather cast into the bronze. She told them the whole story exactly as she had gathered it, keeping nothing back, and she told them what she believed lay inside the metal, and she told them plainly that by the law the bell was hers, and she meant to give it back. And a thing began to happen in the valley that Hollis Thorne, for all his cleverness, had not accounted for. The people who had been scattered and shamed and made to feel each one alone in their ruin began, in twos and threes on that hilltop, to remember that they had once been a we. Word reached Thorne, of course. It always does. He came up the hill himself on a bright morning near the end of April, in his clean collar, with 2 men from the bank behind him and a paper in his hand, and he found Cora and a dozen of the valley's poorest gathered around the broken bell. He was still smiling, but the smile had gone thin at the edges. He had, he announced, made inquiries. He had learned of the foolish rumor, and he was here to inform Mrs. Mabry, sadly, that the sale was void. The chapel and all its contents, he said, had reverted to the bank years ago under an old default of the missions, and the bell was therefore his property, and had been all along, and Amos Pell had had no right to sell it. He held out the paper. It was very official. It had seals on it, and Cora looked at that paper. And then she looked at the smiling man who had buried her husband's memory under the word insolvent and driven her off her own land. And she understood that this was the moment, the exact moment her father had trained her whole life to meet. She did not argue the law with him, for he owned the law in that valley. Instead, she asked him mildly, in front of them all, whether he would care to have the bell weighed. Thorne blinked. She pressed on, her voice carrying clear in the mountain air the way her father had taught her a voice must carry. She said that she was a founder's daughter and knew bell metal, and that this bell weighed near twice what its size should weigh, and rang false besides, and that there was only one honest reason for both those things, and that the reason was cast right into the crown for any man to read who cared to. And she began, slowly, to read aloud the ring of names: Reyes, Halloran, Two Bears, Okafor, Kowalczyk, Vane, and as she read each name, the man or woman who bore it stepped forward out of the little crowd, until Hollis Thorne stood alone with his 2 bankers and his sealed paper, facing a wall of people whose grandparents' silver he had, without knowing it, been trying to seize a second time. And then Cora read the last line into the light. This bell is the trust of all who are named here, and the ransom of the valley in its hour of ruin. Let no man own it. Let it be spent only to raise the fallen. The silence that followed was the kind that gathers after a great bell is struck. Thorne recovered fast. He was clever, and he said, still smiling, that a line of poetry cast in a bell proved nothing, that the metal was worthless scrap, that these were fantasies, and that he would have the sheriff up the hill by nightfall to remove his property. And Cora Mabry answered him with the only weapon she had ever trusted, the one that had never once failed her father. "Then let us settle it honestly, Mr. Thorne," she said. "The way honest men settle things in the open, where the whole valley can see. You say the metal is worthless. I say it is the valley's own silver. Let us bring a fire and an honest scale and the assayer down from Leadville, and let us melt this bell before every soul in Sable Gulch, and weigh what comes out, and read the truth by daylight. If it is worthless scrap, I will owe you an apology, and you may cart it away. But if it is silver, if it is their silver, then you will stand in front of all of them as the man who tried to steal it twice." And she looked him dead in the eye and said gently, the words her father had said in a Nevada square 40 years before, "A lie cannot live in the light, sir. Are you afraid of the sound it will make?" He could not refuse. That was the trap of it. The beautiful, patient trap she had built out of nothing but truth and witnesses. He could not refuse a public weighing without confessing before the whole valley that he feared what it would show. And a man who traded on the word friend cannot afford to be seen afraid of daylight. So it was set for the 1st of May, on the flat below Vane's Hill where the whole town could gather, and Cora sent word down every creek and hollow, and the assayer came down from Leadville with his balances and his acids, and Amos Pell brought his little penciled receipt to prove the sale was clean, and on a blue May morning nearly every living soul in the Alder Valley climbed the hill to watch a penniless widow melt a broken bell. They built the fire in a clay furnace the old miners raised in a single night, and Cora tended it herself, for she knew the heat a founder needs and no other hand in the valley did. And as the bronze softened, she talked to it low under her breath the way her father used to, coaxing, patient. The bell went down slowly into the crucible, the ring of names sinking last of all into the glowing metal. And then the assayer and Cora together poured it off, and let it separate the way she had promised it would, the copper and tin drawing off as bronze. And beneath it, heavier, brighter, unmistakable in the May sun, a broad, shining pool of silver, pooling and cooling into a great rough disk that the assayer weighed on his balance 3 times over because he could not, the first 2 times, believe the figure. Alma Vane and 24 poor families had cast their whole hope into that bell in the winter of '61, and 40 years of the valley's growth and the great silver boom had done nothing to touch it, and now it lay in the grass, in front of them all, weighed and assayed and true. A small fortune in honest silver, worth more than every foreclosed farm in the valley put together, cast in trust and spent, the inscription said, only to raise the fallen. Cora Mabry could have claimed it. It was hers by the law, bought clean for $2 with a witnessed receipt in her pocket, and not one soul on that hillside would have been able to stop her. But she had made her choice weeks before in the empty chapel, and now she made it again in front of them all, which is the harder place to make it. She turned to the assayer and to Amos Pell and to the lawyer she had. In her patience, thought to send 4 from Leadville as well. And before the whole valley, she signed the silver over not to herself, and not to the town, and not to any man who might become another Thorne, but into a trust, bearing the 24 names from the crown, to be administered by the old families together and spent for one purpose only, to redeem every foreclosed farm in the Alder Valley and put it back into the hands that had built it. Alma Vane's ransom, paid out at last in the valley's second hour of ruin, exactly as she had cast it to be, 40 years and 1 honest widow later. And Hollis Thorne? There was no need to raise a hand against him, and Cora did not. His ruin was quieter than that, and more complete. For when the trust's lawyer went to redeem the foreclosed notes, the valley's ledgers were opened in the light for the first time in years, and it came out plain, undeniable, cast into the public record the way the names were cast into the bell that Thorne had been carrying his empire, not on his own gold, but on his depositors' savings, lending out the valley's own money to buy the valley's own farms, a smiling shell held together by nothing but everyone's belief in him. The Silver Trust, refusing his notes and paying its own way, was the one shock the shell could not absorb. His depositors, emboldened by the sight of a widow who had faced him down in daylight, came for their money all at once, and there was not enough, because there never had been, and the truth of it rang out over Sable Gulch like a bell that could not be unrung. No mob touched him. No sheriff needed to. He simply drove his buggy out of the valley one gray morning, with his clean collar and his lap robe and his sealed papers worth nothing now, past the very farms he had tried to steal twice, and the valley let him go in silence, which is the loudest sound a valley can make. A lie cannot live in the light. He had been afraid, in the end, of exactly the sound she said he should fear. At 47, Cora Mabry had owned nothing in the world but the clothes on her back and $11 folded in her sleeve, and the man who cast her out had told her there was no place in the valley for a woman alone, with no money and no man. But she had spent 2 of those dollars on a broken thing that everyone else had written off because she was a founder's daughter, and she could hear, under the ruin, the sound a thing was meant to make. And what was cast inside that cracked chapel bell was never really silver at all. The silver was only the shape it took. What was cast inside it was a promise 24 poor families made to a future they would never see. A promise that in the valley's hour of ruin, no man would be left to fall alone. And Cora Mabry, whom the valley had thrown away, was the one who kept it. They melted the great silver disc down at last, but not into coin. They cast it, most of it, back into a bell, a new bell, poured in Cora's own furnace on Vane's Hill. True bronze this time and ringing clean, with the 24 old names cut once more into the crown and one new name added at the founder's mark below the alder leaf. The way her father had taught her every honest maker signs her work. And on the morning they raised it over the rebuilt chapel and Cora Mabry rang it for the first time. Slow and clear and true, every redeemed farm in the Alder Valley heard the same sound at the same moment. The banker's grandchild and the beggar's alike, ringing for all and owned by none, exactly as a bell is meant to. Thank you for climbing this hill with us tonight, and for staying to the last stroke of the bell. If Cora's story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing the world wrote off may be the very thing that saves them, and before you go, sit with this one question, and, if you're willing, leave your answer in the comments below. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already given up on? We read every one, and we carry them with us up the next hill. Until next time, friend, keep your ear tuned to the quiet things. Keep faith with the fallen, and stay close.